The old man's fingers hovered above the piano keys for a moment, before coming down in perfect harmony. Harold Winters was playing his heart out, just as he had done for nearly a century. The sounds flowing from the grand piano filled every corner of Carnegie Hall, bringing tears to many eyes in the audience. At 103 years old, Harold shouldn't have been able to play like this. His hands should have been too stiff, his mind too foggy to remember such complex pieces. Yet here he was on his birthday, performing a sold-out show that had been booked solid months in advance. "It's like watching history itself perform," whispered a young woman to her companion, not wanting to break the spell Harold was casting with Chopin's Nocturne. The spotlight caught the tears glistening in Harold's cloudy blue eyes as he played. Behind him, a large screen showed black and white photos from his remarkable life. There he was as a skinny 12-year-old boy sitting at a piano much too big for him. Another photo showed him in his 20s, standing proudly outside a music school in Vienna before the war changed everything. Then Harold in his 40s performing for President Kennedy at the White House, the First Lady watching with obvious delight. The audience couldn't take their eyes off him. This living legend who had played for kings and queens, who had taught some of the greatest pianists of the modern era, who had survived 2 world wars and countless personal tragedies, yet still sat straight-backed at his beloved piano. Thomas Bell, Harold's personal assistant for the last 15 years, watched from the wings of the stage. He knew better than anyone the toll these performances took on the old man. Harold had been up since dawn going through his ritual, the special tea he drank, the 30 minutes of finger exercises, the meditation. Thomas had suggested gently that perhaps this should be Harold's final public performance. Harold had just smiled that mysterious smile of his and said, "After tonight, everything will be different anyway." In the front row sat Dr. Ling Chen, a music historian who had written 3 books about Harold Winters. She was recording every moment on her phone, knowing this performance would be analyzed by music students for generations to come. Harold's technique was flawless, his interpretation unmatched. It seemed impossible that anyone so old could play with such passion and precision. "He's not human," she had told her students at the university. "His talent breaks all the rules of what we know about aging and musical ability." As Harold finished the first piece, the audience erupted in applause. He acknowledged them with a slight bow of his head but didn't stand. At 103, some concessions had to be made to age. His hands remained on the keys, ready for the next piece, a challenging Beethoven sonata that pianists half his age struggled to master. In the third row, Jackson Fuller, a music critic who had followed Harold's career for decades, scribbled notes furiously. He had come tonight expecting to write a respectful review about an elderly master, showing glimpses of his former brilliance. Instead, he was witnessing something that defied explanation. Harold wasn't just playing well for his age. He was playing better than ever before. The Beethoven piece began, and Harold closed his eyes, letting his fingers find their way across the keys as they had done countless times before. The photos on the screen behind him changed, showing Harold through the decades, receiving awards, teaching at Juilliard, playing at famous venues around the world. What the audience didn't see were the private moments. Harold weeping alone in his apartment after his wife's death 50 years ago. Harold turning down a second chance at love because his music demanded all of him. Harold practicing until his fingers bled when he was in his 70s, refusing to let age diminish his gift. As the piece reached its most difficult passage, Harold's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed. In the sound booth, the recording technician shook his head in wonder. He had recorded hundreds of pianists over the years, but never had he heard such clarity, such emotion. "It's like he's not even touching the keys," he told his assistant. "It's like the piano is playing itself." The audience held its collective breath. Even those who knew nothing about classical music could feel they were witnessing something extraordinary. Parents who had brought reluctant children to experience a piece of living history now watched as those same children sat transfixed, unable to look away from the old man making magic with 88 keys. In the back row, Rose Harper, a nurse who had cared for Harold during a hospital stay last winter, watched with tears streaming down her face. She remembered how he had seemed so frail then, his hands shaking as he took his medicine. The doctors had warned that he might never play again after his bout with pneumonia. Yet here he was, defying medicine, defying time itself. "He told me he had unfinished business," she whispered to her husband. I guess this is what he meant. As Harold moved from Beethoven to Mozart, the light shifted, casting his face in shadow. For a moment, he looked young again, the same determined expression he had worn in those photos from the 1930s. His secret had remained safe all these years, buried beneath awards and acclaim and the passage of time. But tonight, everything would change. In the wings, Thomas checked his watch. The program was moving faster than expected. Harold usually took longer pauses between pieces, gathering his strength. But tonight he seemed possessed, moving from one masterpiece to another with barely a moment's rest. He's going to wear himself out, Thomas muttered to the stage manager. He won't have anything left for the finale. The stage manager just shrugged. Have you ever known Mr. Winters to not finish a performance? She was right, of course. In his entire career, spanning more than 80 years, Harold had never once canceled a performance or left a program unfinished. Not when he had a fever of 103. Not when he received news of his brother's death minutes before going on stage. Not even when an air raid siren had sounded during a wartime concert in London. As Mozart gave way to Liszt, gasps rippled through the audience. The Liszt piece wasn't on the program. It was a notoriously difficult composition that most pianists wouldn't attempt in public. Yet Harold played it as casually as if it were a simple nursery rhyme. In the orchestra section, a young piano prodigy named Lily watched with her mouth open. She had been practicing this very piece for months and still couldn't get through it without mistakes. That's not possible, she whispered to her teacher. No one can play that from memory at his age. Her teacher, who had once taken a master class with Harold back in the 1980s, just nodded. That's why he's Harold Winters and the rest of us are just pianists. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Harold had never practiced this piece at all. He had heard it once 57 years ago at a competition in Moscow. The gifted Soviet pianist who played it had taken first prize. Harold had taken second, a rare disappointment in his storied career. He had never forgotten that piece or the way it was played. As the Liszt composition reached its thunderous conclusion, Harold finally allowed himself a small smile. His secret had been hiding in plain sight all these years. Tonight, after one final piece, he would tell them all. The audience applauded wildly as Harold paused. He took a sip of water from the glass Thomas had placed on the piano. His hands trembled slightly, the first sign of weakness he had shown all evening. For his final piece, Harold had chosen a Chopin nocturne, the same one he had played for his mother on her deathbed when he was just 16. As the gentle, haunting melody filled the hall, many in the audience closed their eyes, transported by the beauty of it. They didn't notice when Harold's eyes drifted to the ceiling of the famous hall, perhaps seeing beyond it to whatever lies after this life. They didn't notice when a single tear rolled down his cheek and landed on the keys. They only knew that they had never heard the piece played with such raw emotion. As the final notes faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence before the audience rose as one, applauding with a force that seemed to shake the building's foundation. Harold sat still at the piano, eyes now open, looking out at the sea of faces. They thought they knew him. They thought they understood his gift. They had no idea. Thomas stepped forward with Harold's cane, ready to help him rise for his bow. But Harold waved him away. Tonight he would stand on his own. Tonight he would finally tell the truth that had been burning inside him for nearly a century. The audience continued to cheer as Harold slowly, painfully rose from the bench. He shuffled to the microphone at center stage, his small bent frame casting a long shadow. The applause gradually quieted as people realized he was about to speak, something he rarely did at performances. "Thank you," Harold said, his voice surprisingly strong and clear for a man his age. "Thank you for coming to celebrate my birthday with me. For over 80 years I have been blessed to share music with the world." He paused, looking out at the expectant faces. Every person in that hall believed they were in the presence of one of history's greatest musical geniuses. What they would think after tonight, Harold couldn't guess. "But there's something I need to tell you," he continued, gripping the microphone stand for support. "A confession I can no longer keep to myself." The hall went completely silent. Even the usual coughs and rustling had stopped. Every ear strained to catch his words. Every eye was fixed on the frail old man who had just played like someone a quarter of his age. "You see," Harold said, a lifetime of secrecy in his voice. "I've been keeping something from you all. Something about me and about music that will change everything you thought you knew." The audience sat frozen as Harold Winters gripped the microphone. His confession hung in the air unfinished. For over 80 years, he had been celebrated as a musical genius. Every person in Carnegie Hall that night had come to witness a living legend. Now they waited, barely breathing, to hear what secret this 103-year-old man had kept hidden for so long. "The truth is," Harold continued, his voice gaining strength, "I have never been able to read music. Not a single note." A confused murmur spread through the crowd. People glanced at one another, sure they had misheard. Harold Winters, the man who had recorded all of Chopin's works, who had taught at the world's finest music schools, who had written books on piano technique, couldn't read music. "Every piece I've ever played," Harold said, "I learned by ear. One listening is all I need. I hear a piece once and I can play it perfectly. Every note, every pause, every feeling behind it." Dr. Ling Chen dropped her phone in shock. The music historian had spent her career studying Harold's supposed interpretations of classical pieces. If what he was saying was true, they weren't interpretations at all. They were perfect copies. "I know this sounds impossible," Harold said, noticing the disbelief on people's faces. "But let me explain how it began." He motioned to Thomas, who quickly brought a chair to center stage. Harold sat down, grateful to take weight off his tired legs. The spotlight followed him, casting a golden glow around his white hair. "I was born in a small village in Eastern Europe," Harold said. "My family was poor. My father worked in a factory, my mother cleaned houses. We had no money for music lessons, certainly no piano. But the family my mother worked for had a beautiful grand piano, and the wife played it every afternoon." Harold's eyes took on a faraway look as he traveled back in time. "I was 6 years old when my mother first took me to that house. While she cleaned, I hid under a table, listening to the woman play Beethoven. That night, when we returned home to our tiny apartment, I went to the wooden crate we used as a table and began tapping my fingers on it. My mother nearly fainted when she realized I was playing the exact piece we had heard earlier, on a wooden box." The audience leaned forward, captivated. Harold Winters had rarely spoken about his childhood before. His official biography claimed he had begun formal training at age 4. Word spread about the poor boy who could play piano music without a piano. Soon, wealthy people in town were paying to see me perform. A kind doctor arranged for me to use the piano in the town hall for 1 hour each Sunday. That's when I discovered that I could play anything after hearing it just once. Harold paused, taking a sip of water. His hand trembled slightly. Then came the war. I was 17 when my parents put me on a boat to America. They saved for months to buy that ticket. "Your gift will keep you alive there," my father told me. They were right. But they never made it out themselves. A heavy silence fell over the hall. In the third row, music critic Jackson Fuller scribbled frantically in his notebook. This was the story of the century. When I arrived in New York, I had nothing but the clothes on my back and my strange ability. I soon learned that being able to play wasn't enough in America. Everyone wanted to know where I studied, who taught me, what credentials I had. Nobody cared about a refugee who could play by ear. Harold's gaze swept across the audience, his blue eyes surprisingly sharp. So I lied. I created a whole history for myself. Studies at the finest European conservatories, famous teachers who had died in the war and couldn't contradict me. I forged letters of recommendation. I changed my name to something more American-sounding. And I pretended to read music. A photographer in the press section snapped pictures rapidly, capturing every expression that crossed Harold's face as he unburdened himself of his lifelong secret. I would ask other musicians to play pieces for me first, claiming I was studying their technique. In reality, I was memorizing the music. During performances, I would pretend to turn pages of sheet music I couldn't understand. I became very good at faking it. In the wings of the stage, Thomas Bell stood with his mouth open. He had worked for Harold for 15 years and never suspected. He had seen Harold with sheet music countless times, making notes in the margins, discussing changes with orchestra conductors. As my fame grew, so did my deception, Harold continued. I wrote books about music theory that were really just things I'd heard other musicians say. I taught master classes where I never actually read the music my students played. I just listened and repeated what I heard with my own improvements. I became an expert at pretending to be an expert. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some looked angry, others fascinated. Many simply couldn't process what they were hearing. You might wonder why I'm telling you this now at the end of my life, Harold said, his voice growing softer. The truth is, I'm tired of living a lie, and I believe my real gift, this ability to hear and reproduce music instantly, is far more valuable than the fake background I created. In the front row, a young man stood up. Harold recognized him as Vincent Potter, the current head of the music department at Juilliard, where Harold had taught for 30 years. "Mr. Winters," Potter said, his voice tight with anger, "are you saying you deceived the music world for 80 years? That your interpretations of the classics, which we've all studied and admired, were just copies of performances you heard?" Harold nodded slowly. "Yes and no. I copied it first, but over time I began to add my own feelings, my own touch. What you've heard me play tonight is completely my own interpretation, though I learned all these pieces initially by ear." Whispers spread through the audience. Was this a publicity stunt? Had age affected the old man's mind? Another person stood up. Howard Grant, a neuroscientist known for his research on musical ability and the brain. Harold had read about him in a magazine. "Mr. Winters," Grant said, "what you're describing is extremely rare. A condition called absolute auditory memory combined with perfect pitch and exceptional motor skills. If what you're saying is true, your brain is 1 in a billion. Would you be willing to undergo some tests to document this ability?" "That's actually why I'm coming forward now," Harold replied. "I'd like whatever time I have left to be useful to science. Perhaps understanding my brain could help others." A woman rose from her seat near the back. "How do we know you're telling the truth now?" she called out. "You just admitted to lying for your entire career." The audience murmured in agreement. Harold nodded, accepting the skepticism. "You're right to doubt me," he said. "I've lied for so long that I don't deserve your trust. But I can prove what I'm saying." He turned to look at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces until he found who he was looking for. "In the audience tonight is Jun Yamamoto, one of the greatest living pianists. Mr. Yamamoto, would you honor me by coming to the stage?" There was a stir as a middle-aged Japanese man in an elegant suit made his way to the stage. Jun Yamamoto was indeed famous, a master of obscure, technically challenging pieces that few pianists attempted. "Mr. Yamamoto," Harold said when the pianist joined him on stage, "would you play something for me? Something you've never recorded. Something few people know. Perhaps even something you've composed yourself that hasn't been performed publicly." Yamamoto looked uncertain. "You want me to play and then you'll—" "I'll play it back, note for note," Harold said, without ever having heard it before tonight. A piano technician quickly rolled a second grand piano onto the stage. The audience watched in tense silence as Yamamoto seated himself at one piano, while Harold returned to his original position at the other. Yamamoto paused, thinking. Then his fingers touched the keys and a haunting melody filled the hall. It was complex, with unusual timing and chords that seemed to clash before resolving in unexpected ways. He played for about 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Harold sat with his eyes closed, his fingers twitching slightly on his lap. Then, without a word, he placed his gnarled hands on the keys of his own piano and began to play. Note for note, rhythm for rhythm, Harold reproduced exactly what Yamamoto had played. The audience gasped. Yamamoto himself watched with widening eyes as Harold not only matched his piece, but somehow enhanced it, bringing out emotions that Yamamoto himself hadn't fully expressed. When Harold finished, Yamamoto bowed deeply to him. "That was my own composition," he told the audience, his voice shaking slightly. "I finished writing it last week. No one has heard it until tonight." The implications of what they had just witnessed sank in. Harold Winters hadn't been lying. His unbelievable claim was true. In that moment, everything changed. The audience that had come to honor a traditional musical genius now realized they were in the presence of something far rarer, a human anomaly whose brain worked like no other. Howard. Grant was already making his way to the stage, phone in hand, calling colleagues. Dr. Ling Chen was furiously rewriting her understanding of Harold's career in her notes, and music critic Jackson Fuller had stopped writing entirely, too stunned to form coherent thoughts. As for Harold himself, he felt lighter than he had in decades. The burden of his secret was gone. For the first time in his long life, he was truly known. "There's more to my story," he said into the microphone, "and more I can show you of this strange gift I was born with. But first, I think we all need a moment to process what just happened." He glanced at Thomas, who stood frozen in the wings. The loyal assistant who thought he knew everything about his famous employer was now a stranger in a familiar body. The truth, Harold said softly, changes everything. And we're just getting started. The morning after Harold's shocking confession, the news spread everywhere. His face appeared on television screens, websites, and newspapers around the world. 103-year-old piano legend reveals lifetime secret, the headlines shouted. People who had never heard of Harold Winters before were suddenly fascinated by his story. In a private room at the Plaza Hotel, Harold sat by the window, watching the city wake up. His performance and confession had drained him, but he felt strangely peaceful. Thomas entered with a tray of breakfast and a stack of newspapers. "You've caused quite a stir," Thomas said, placing the tray on a small table. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing since last night." "Everyone wants to talk to you." Harold nodded slowly. "And how are you, Thomas? Learning your boss of 15 years has been lying must be difficult." Thomas poured a cup of tea and handed it to Harold. "I'm still processing it, but I'm more amazed than upset. All those times I saw you reading music." "I wasn't reading," Harold said. "I was remembering what I'd heard. The sheet music was just a prop. I'm sorry for the deception." Before Thomas could respond, the phone rang again. He checked the caller ID and raised his eyebrows. "It's Dr. Howard Grant, the neuroscientist from last night." Harold nodded. "Put him on speaker, please." Dr. Grant's excited voice filled the room. "Mr. Winters, thank you for taking my call. I've been up all night thinking about your remarkable ability. I've consulted with colleagues at Columbia University Medical Center, and we'd like to invite you for some tests. Nothing invasive, I promise. Just brain scans while you listen to and reproduce music." Harold sipped his tea thoughtfully. "What would be the purpose of these tests, Doctor?" "Your brain could help us understand memory in ways we never have before," Grant replied. "Think about it. You can hear something once and reproduce it perfectly decades later. Most people can't remember what they had for breakfast 3 days ago." Harold chuckled. "Oatmeal with blueberries. That's what I had 3 days ago." "Exactly," Grant exclaimed. "Your memory is extraordinary. And at your age, when most people experience significant cognitive decline, Mr. Winters, you could advance our understanding of the brain by years, maybe decades." Harold glanced at Thomas, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Very well, Dr. Grant, I'll do your tests. But on one condition, I want to understand everything you learn. No keeping secrets from the old man." "Absolutely," Grant agreed eagerly. "We can schedule the first session for tomorrow if you're feeling up to it." After they hung up, Thomas handed Harold a newspaper. "The music world is in shock. Some people are calling you a fraud, others a miracle." Harold scanned the article with a small smile. "I've been called worse things in my time." For the next few days, Harold's life became a whirlwind of activity. Each morning, Dr. Grant and his team attached electrodes to Harold's head and showed him into the tunnel of an MRI machine. They played music for him. Pieces he knew, pieces he didn't, pieces they created just for the tests. Each time, Harold reproduced exactly what he heard, whether it was a complex symphony or random notes without any pattern. "It's astonishing," Dr. Grant told a group of colleagues gathered in the observation room. "Look at his brain activity. When he listens to music, his auditory cortex lights up like a Christmas tree. But so do regions associated with muscle memory and emotional processing. It's as if his entire brain is involved in hearing and storing the music." A young researcher pointed at the screen. "And look here. No decline in neural pathways despite his age. If anything, they appear more developed than normal." Meanwhile, the music world was having its own reaction to Harold's confession. Some former students felt betrayed. Others were even more impressed, knowing now that his musical accomplishments had come without the benefit of formal training or the ability to read notes. Jun Yamamoto, the pianist who had helped prove Harold's ability on stage, gave an interview to the New York Times. "What Mr. Winters can do is beyond technique," he said. "It's beyond what we understand about music. He doesn't just hear notes, he hears the soul of the piece." On the 5th day of testing, Dr. Grant brought in a special guest, Dr. Lucia Rivera, a renowned expert on savant syndrome and exceptional abilities. "Mr. Winters," she said after observing him play, "have you ever been able to do this with anything besides music? Can you remember other things with this level of detail?" Harold thought for a moment. "Just music. But I can remember everything about music, not just classical pieces. If I hear a jazz improvisation, I can play it back note for note. If someone whistles a tune they made up, I can reproduce it on the piano instantly." Dr. Rivera nodded. And when did you first notice this ability? I was 6, Harold replied. But my parents said even as a baby I could hum back melodies perfectly after hearing them once. The doctors exchanged meaningful glances. We think you may have a form of savant syndrome, Dr. Rivera explained. But unlike most savants who show extreme abilities from birth and often have challenges in other areas, yours seems to be highly focused with no other cognitive effects. Harold laughed softly. You mean I'm weird but only about music? Dr. Grant smiled. Essentially, yes. And we'd like to share our findings with the public, with your permission. Your brain could help countless people. Harold agreed, and a week later he found himself in an auditorium at Columbia University. The room was filled with doctors, students, musicians, and reporters. Large screens displayed colorful images of Harold's brain as he listened to and played music. Dr. Grant stood at a podium, pointing at the images. What you're seeing is unprecedented. Mr. Winters's brain has developed neural pathways specifically for processing and reproducing music that are more extensive than anything we've ever documented. He clicked to the next slide. More remarkably, these pathways haven't degraded with age. At 103, Mr. Winters has the auditory memory and processing ability of someone in their 20s, possibly even better. A hand raised in the audience. Could this be learned, or is he simply born this way? Dr. Rivera stepped forward. We believe Mr. Winters was born with this predisposition, but his lifetime of using and developing this ability has strengthened these neural pathways. It's nature and nurture working together in an extraordinary way. Another hand went up. Could this help people with memory disorders like Alzheimer's? Dr. Grant nodded eagerly. That's exactly what we're hoping. By understanding how Mr. Winters' brain forms and maintains these incredibly strong memory connections, we might develop new approaches for treating memory disorders or enhancing memory function in healthy individuals. As the doctors continued their presentation, Harold sat quietly on stage. He was tired but content. After decades of hiding his true self, of pretending to be someone he wasn't, his secret had become his greatest contribution. During the question period, a young piano student stood up. Mr. Winters, do you regret lying about your abilities for so long? Do you feel guilty about deceiving everyone? A hush fell over the room. Harold leaned toward his microphone. When I came to America, I was a scared boy who had lost everything. My ability was all I had, but no one would give me a chance without credentials. So yes, I lied. I created a past I never had. I pretended to read music I could only hear. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I regret the deception, but I don't regret the music I've shared. Every performance was genuinely me, even if the story behind it wasn't. And now in my final years, I can be completely honest about who I am and how my mind works. The young student nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. Later that afternoon, as Thomas helped Harold into a taxi, a group of children approached them. They were students from a nearby music school, clutching programs from Harold's Carnegie Hall performance. Mr. Winters, one little boy said shyly, my teacher says you're special, that your brain works differently than everyone else's. Harold smiled at the child. That's true. Everyone's brain is unique, but mine is a bit more unusual than most. A little girl with glasses too big for her face piped up. Can you teach us how to play like you do? Harold shook his head gently. I can't teach you to hear music the way I do. That's something I was born with. But I can teach you something more important, to be yourself. Don't pretend to be someone you're not, like I did for so many years. The children nodded solemnly, though it was clear they didn't fully understand. As the taxi pulled away, Thomas noticed tears in Harold's eyes. Are you all right? He asked with concern. Harold nodded, wiping his cheeks. For the first time in my life, I'm completely all right. I've told the truth. I'm helping science. And those children looked at me with wonder, not because I was pretending to be a traditional musical genius, but because of who I really am. Thomas smiled. So what happens next in this remarkable life of yours? Harold gazed out the window at the city rushing by. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, it will be honest. And after a century of living behind a mask, that feels like the greatest gift of all. The taxi turned a corner, heading toward an uncertain but truthful future, one that Harold Winters, at 103 years old, was finally ready to embrace. 3 months after Harold's confession, His life had changed in ways he never imagined. The small apartment where he had lived quietly for decades was now filled with new energy. Scientific journals wanted to feature him on their covers. Documentary filmmakers followed him around. Schools invited him to speak to children about being different. "I never expected this much attention," Harold told Thomas as they sorted through the day's mail. Dozens of letters from around the world. "At my age, I thought I'd be forgotten, not discovered." Thomas smiled as he opened another envelope. "Here's another one from that music school in London. They're naming their new piano wing after you." Harold shook his head in wonder. Not bad for a boy who couldn't read music. That afternoon, Harold had his weekly appointment at Columbia University Medical Center. Dr. Grant and his team had been studying Harold's brain for months now, and each test revealed something new. "Today we're trying something different," Dr. Grant explained as he adjusted the equipment. "We're going to play music that's intentionally wrong, classical pieces with mistakes added. We want to see how your brain responds." Harold nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. The technicians placed the now familiar cap of electrodes on his head and helped him lie down in the MRI machine. Through special headphones, they played a familiar Beethoven sonata, but with subtle errors, a wrong note here, an altered rhythm there. Harold's fingers twitched as he listened, his forehead creasing in concentration. When the piece ended, Dr. Grant helped Harold to a piano in the corner of the lab. "Can you play what you just heard?" Harold's hands hovered over the keys for a moment. Then he began to play, but he didn't play the flawed version they had just presented. He played it correctly as Beethoven had written it. Dr. Grant exchanged excited glances with his colleagues. "Harold, did you notice the mistakes in the recording?" "Of course," Harold replied. "They were painful to hear. But you didn't reproduce them. You corrected them automatically." Harold looked surprised. "I didn't realize I was doing that. I just played it the way it's supposed to be." Dr. Rivera stepped forward, her eyes bright with interest. "Mr. Winters, this suggests your brain isn't just recording music like a tape player. It's understanding the structure, the rules, the patterns of music on a profound level. When you hear something that breaks those patterns, your brain automatically fixes it." Harold considered this. "I suppose that makes sense. Even as a child, if someone played a wrong note, I would wince. It felt wrong in my head, like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit." The scientists huddled together, talking excitedly. Harold watched them, remembering how for most of his life he had hidden his true abilities, afraid of being seen as strange or different. Now those same abilities were being celebrated as extraordinary. That evening, Harold received an unexpected visitor. Lily Chen, the 12-year-old piano prodigy who had attended his Carnegie Hall performance, had come with her grandfather. "Mr. Winters," the old man said, bowing slightly, "my granddaughter has been talking about you nonstop since your concert. She has questions that no one else can answer." Harold welcomed them into his living room. Lily sat at the edge of the couch, clutching a notebook. "Is it true you never took a lesson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold smiled. "Not a formal one, no. But I learned from everyone I heard play. Every pianist I listened to was my teacher in a way." Lily's eyes widened. "I practice 6 hours a day. My teachers say I must study the theory and the history and the technique. But you never did any of that?" "I did it differently," Harold explained gently. "I absorbed music in my own way. That doesn't mean your way is wrong. We're just different." The girl's grandfather leaned forward. She has been struggling. The pressure of competitions, the endless practice. She was ready to quit piano altogether. Then she heard your story. Harold looked at Lily with newfound understanding. "And now?" "Now I wonder if there are other ways to make music," Lily said. "Ways that feel right for me." Harold thought for a moment, then stood slowly, making his way to the piano in the corner. "Come sit with me," he said to Lily. For the next hour, Harold worked with the young girl, not teaching technique or theory, but helping her listen, truly listen, to the music she was playing. He showed her how to feel the emotion behind the notes, how to let the music tell a story. "Play it like you're telling me about your best day ever," he suggested when she tackled a challenging Chopin piece. "Now play it like you're sharing a secret." Lily's playing transformed before her grandfather's eyes. The notes were the same, but suddenly they had life, personality, meaning. "That's it," Harold said softly. "You're not just playing notes anymore. You're speaking through them." When they finally left, Lily hugged Harold fiercely. "Thank you," she whispered. "I think I found my way." Thomas, who had watched the impromptu lesson, handed Harold his evening tea. "You should do that more often," he said. "You have so much to share." Harold sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Perhaps I do." The next day, Harold called Dr. Grant with an idea. "I want to start a program," he said, "for children who learn differently. Not just music, but all subjects. My brain works in an unusual way with music. Other children have their own unique ways of understanding the world." Dr. Grant was enthusiastic. "We could combine education with research. Study how different brains learn while actually helping children thrive. Harold, this could be revolutionary." Within weeks, plans for the Winters Institute for Neurodiverse Learning began taking shape. Harold donated most of his savings, money from decades of concerts and recordings, to fund it. Universities offered research support. Famous musicians signed on to help with the music program. The project gave Harold new energy. Despite his age and occasionally shaky health, he attended every planning meeting, reviewed architectural drawings, and insisted on meeting potential teachers personally. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Thomas warned one evening as Harold reviewed curriculum proposals well past midnight. Harold looked up, his blue eyes clear and determined. "I spent 80 years pretending to be someone I wasn't, Thomas. Now I have a chance to help children embrace who they truly are. I can't waste a day of whatever time I have left." 6 months after his Carnegie Hall confession, Harold found himself cutting a ribbon at a renovated building near Columbia University. The Winters Institute was officially opening, with 15 students enrolled in its pilot program. Each child had been selected because they learned in unconventional ways. The boy who couldn't read but could solve complex math problems in his head. The girl who struggled with speaking but could paint emotions with breathtaking clarity. The twins who had taught themselves 5 languages by watching foreign films. "This is not a school for geniuses," Harold explained to reporters at the opening ceremony. "It's a school for different minds. We don't try to fix these children. We help them understand their unique way of seeing the world, and we build education around that." Dr. Grant stood beside Harold, beaming with pride. "What we learn here will help all children. By understanding how diverse brains work, we can create better ways of teaching everyone." As the ceremony ended and the children explored their new classrooms, a reporter asked Harold, "After a lifetime of hiding your true abilities, how does it feel to see them celebrated like this?" Harold watched the children, bright, curious, and often misunderstood by traditional education, as they found a place where their differences were valued, not hidden. "It feels like coming home," he said simply, "like finally being allowed to be myself." Later that day, Harold sat at a piano in the Institute's music room. A few of the children gathered around, watching with curiosity as the old man's fingers moved across the keys with impossible precision. "How do you remember all those notes?" one boy asked. Harold smiled. "My brain holds on to music the way your brain understands numbers instantly." "We all have our gifts." A small girl with wild curly hair tugged at his sleeve. "Will you teach us to play like you?" Harold gently shook his head. "I can't teach you to play like me, but I can help you discover how you play best. And that's much more important." As the children crowded around the piano, each eager to show Harold their own unique way of making music, Thomas watched from the doorway. He saw not a 103-year-old man nearing the end of his life, but a boy from a poor European village who had finally found his purpose. "You seem happy," Thomas said later as they drove home. Harold gazed out the car window at the city lights. "For most of my life, I was either hiding who I was or being celebrated for who I wasn't. Now finally, I'm valued for who I actually am, and I'm helping these children avoid my mistakes." He turned to Thomas with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, I'm happy, and the music in my head has never sounded so clear." 1 year after the opening of the Winters Institute, Harold celebrated his 104th birthday. The party was held in the main hall of the school, with students, scientists, and musicians gathering to honor the man who had changed how they understood music and the brain. "I never expected to see 104, Harold told the crowd, his voice thin but clear. "I certainly never expected to spend my final years being studied like a curious specimen." This brought laughter from the scientist in the room. "But mostly I never expected to find such freedom in finally telling the truth." The Winters Institute had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What began with 15 students now had 50, with hundreds more on the waiting list. Dr. Grant's research team had published groundbreaking papers about Harold's brain and how it processed music, leading to new therapies for memory disorders. Musicians from around the world came to study the teaching methods, develop their approaches that focused on how each individual brain best understood and created music. After the birthday cake was cut and the songs were sung, Harold sat at the piano that dominated the center of the room. The crowd fell silent, knowing they were about to witness something special. For over 80 years, Harold said, I played other people's music. I played it my way, but it was still music that came from outside me. Today I want to share something different, music that comes from inside. His fingers touched the keys, and a melody unlike anything the audience had heard before filled the room. It wasn't classical or jazz or any recognizable style. It was Harold's life in music. The boy hiding under a table listening to a rich woman play Beethoven. The frightened refugee on a boat to America. The famous pianist living a lie. And finally, the truth-teller finding peace in his final years. When the last note faded, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Harold looked up, surprised to see people wiping away tears. Was it that bad? He joked. It was that true, Dr. Rivera replied, squeezing his shoulder gently. Later that evening, as Thomas helped Harold prepare for bed, the old man seemed unusually thoughtful. A penny for your thoughts? Thomas said as he handed Harold his nighttime medications. Harold smiled faintly. I was thinking about my parents. They put me on that boat to America believing my musical gift would save me. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. He swallowed his pills with a sip of water. I wish they could have seen all this. Not the fame or the money, but the children at the Institute. Children who won't have to hide who they are like I did. Thomas nodded. They would have been proud. Yes, Harold agreed. I think they would. The next morning, Harold had his regular appointment at the medical center. The team had been monitoring subtle changes in his brain over the past year. Not deterioration exactly, but shifts in how neural pathways functioned. Your brain is adapting, Dr. Grant explained as they reviewed the latest scans. As certain physical abilities decline with age, your brain is finding new ways to accomplish the same tasks. It's quite remarkable. Harold studied the colorful images of his brain with interest. So I'm not losing my abilities? Not exactly, Dr. Grant said carefully. You're compensating. Your fingers may be a bit slower, but your brain is finding shortcuts to maintain the same level of performance. Most people's brains can't adapt this effectively at your age. As they finished the tests, Dr. Grant hesitated, then said, Harold, we'd like to discuss something important with you. It's about the future of our research. Harold raised an eyebrow. That sounds ominous. Not at all, Dr. Grant assured him. Quite the opposite. We believe that studying your brain after your death could lead to even more significant breakthroughs. Harold laughed softly. You're asking for my brain when I'm done with it? Essentially, yes, Dr. Grant admitted. It would be an incredible gift to science. Harold thought about this for a moment, then nodded. Why not? It served me well for over a century. If it can help others after I'm gone, all the better. The paperwork was drawn up that afternoon. Harold signed it with a steady hand, donating his brain to the research program at Columbia after his death. That's settled then, he said briskly. Now can we get back to the living? I have a class to teach. The class Harold referred to was a special session he taught twice weekly at the Institute. It wasn't strictly a music class, though music was always involved. It was more about listening, truly listening to the world around you. Today, 6 children sat in a semicircle around Harold's piano. They ranged in age from 7 to 13, each with their own unique way of processing information. Some struggled with traditional learning methods but showed remarkable abilities in specific areas. Close your eyes, Harold instructed them. I'm going to play something and I want you to tell me what you see in your mind. His fingers danced across the keys, creating a light, playful melody. When he finished, each child shared a different vision. One saw butterflies in a meadow, another imagined raindrops on a window, a third described her grandmother's kitchen on baking day. That's wonderful, Harold said. Now, who can remember the music I just played? A small boy with glasses raised his hand. Harold nodded to him and the child hummed the entire melody perfectly. Very good, Theo, Harold said with a smile. You hear music the way I do. Now, can you play it back on the piano? The boy shook his head. I can hear it, but my fingers don't know where to go. That's where we're different, Harold explained. I can translate what I hear directly to my fingers. But your gift is just as special. You might use it differently than I use mine. After class, as the children filed out, Lily Chen, now a teaching assistant at the institute, approached Harold. "Mr. Winters," she said, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She hesitated, then continued, "Do you think your ability is some kind of compensation? Like because you couldn't read music, your brain found another way?" Harold considered this. Dr. Rivera would say my brain found efficient neural pathways to process music. But in simpler terms, yes, I think we all find ways to work with what we have. Your way isn't wrong, just different from mine. Lily nodded thoughtfully. The children love you, you know. You make them feel special instead of strange. Harold smiled. They are special. And being different isn't the same as being wrong. That evening, Harold gave a special performance at Carnegie Hall, the same venue where he had made his confession a year earlier. This time the event was a fundraiser for the Winters Institute and the hall was filled to capacity. Instead of performing alone, Harold shared the stage with students from the institute. Some played instruments with remarkable skill. Others contributed in different ways, creating visual art inspired by the music, using technology to transform sound into color and shape, or sharing how music affected their unique minds. When it was Harold's turn to perform, he played the original composition he had debuted at his birthday party. This time he had titled it, "Finally Me." The audience rose in a standing ovation as the final notes faded away. Harold stood with effort, leaning on his cane, and bowed deeply. "Thank you," he said when the applause finally quieted. "A year ago I stood on this stage and confessed to a lifetime of deception. I was terrified of rejection, of losing everything I had built. Instead, I found acceptance and purpose." He gestured to the students standing to the side of the stage. "These young people won't have to hide their true selves. They won't have to pretend to be normal to be valued. That's worth more than all the applause I've received in my life." Later that night, as Thomas drove him home, Harold stared out the window at the city lights. "It's been a good year," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. "The best is yet to come. The institute is growing, the research is just getting started." "I won't see most of it," Harold interrupted gently. "We both know that. But I've done what I needed to do. My parents put me on that boat believing my gift would save me. In the end, I think it's saving others instead." 2 months later, Harold suffered a stroke. It didn't take his life, but it took something perhaps more precious to him, his ability to play the piano. His right hand remained curled and unresponsive, despite the best efforts of physical therapists. Yet Harold didn't despair. Instead, he focused on teaching and sharing what he knew. He could still hear music perfectly, still remember every note he'd ever heard. And now he had new insights to share with the children at the institute. About adapting, about finding new ways forward when old paths were blocked. "The music doesn't stop," he told them during his first class after returning from the hospital. "Even if my fingers can't play anymore, the music is still in my head, still in my heart. Nothing can take that away." On a bright spring morning, 6 months after his stroke, Harold sat in the garden of the Winters Institute, surrounded by blooming flowers and the sound of children practicing music nearby. Thomas sat beside him reading the latest research paper about Harold's remarkable brain. "They're calling it Winters mapping," Thomas said. "This new way of understanding how the brain processes music. It's already helping people with auditory processing disorders." Harold smiled, his face weathered but peaceful. "Good. That's good." A butterfly landed on the arm of his wheelchair, its wings gently opening and closing. Harold watched it with childlike wonder. "You know," he said softly, "for most of my life I was afraid that if people knew the truth about me, they would think less of me. I was so wrong. The truth set me free, and now it's helping set others free too." The butterfly took flight, soaring up into the clear blue sky. Harold followed its path with his eyes,